Hi, everybody. This is Professor Giordano. I want to introduce you to the content of week 4 and also talk a little bit about writing an art historical comparison and contrast essay. Now, our assignment for the week is a discussion board around the idea of comparing and contrasting two artworks, but I still use the term essay to describe that because all the writing that we do in the course is a form of analysis that could be categorized as a piece of formal college level writing. So before we get going on that, I just want to say that this is the first time you're hearing my voice. The lectures for the class, the slide lectures, have been recorded by Professor Virginia Rose, who originally developed this course. So what I'm going to be doing from this point forward is providing these occasional screencasts which offer some perspectives on the material that we're working with now. And as for week 4, I think it's an interesting time to really start digging into the concepts of the course now that you've gotten your feet wet. So I want to help contextualize the slide lectures and the readings with just a couple of basic points. Before I do that, let's just go through the week. Right now we're focusing on the School of Paris, which is basically primitivism, Fauvism, and Cubism. That's broken out over 2 lectures here. And the reading in Gompertz, which are chapters 6 and 7. Now, depending on how you learn best, you might want to do the readings first if you like to absorb ideas through text and then go to the videos. If you're like me and you're a visual learner, you might want to start with the videos and then read the texts. There's also a few readings this week that are very short by Henri Matisse, the artist, as well as Guillaume Apollinaire, who wrote very much about the subject of modern painting. And these are really great perspectives on the ideas, the tenets, what art is valued when it came to modernism. Now, also importantly this week, we have a third video, which is an excerpt from the BBC series narrated by art critic Robert Hughes called The Shock of the New. This came out actually in 1980. So it's a rather old series of films on modernism, but they are really just as relevant today as they were when they were done in the early 1980s, because they talk about the kinds of social and cultural conditions that set up the ideas behind particular art movements. So please watch the first 27 minutes of The Shock of the New this week, because Robert Hughes does a really good job talking about the way that technological advancement changed the values of a culture, particularly with regard to Paris in the late 19th century and the very first years of the 20th century. What I find particularly interesting about this is the fact that not only did technology advance at a rate in the second half of the 19th century to a degree greater than probably all the centuries leading up to the second half of the 19th century, but artists are starting to feel a sense of discomfort with the modern world. Is technology really this wonderful thing that society generally thinks it is? And as we get into the World War I period later, we'll see that this question comes up even more. But one of the ways that they respond to the advancement of technology is by looking to non-Western art. We saw this already with Gauguin looking at Tahitian art and actually going to Tahiti, living amongst people that he considered living closer to the land, closer to nature. And now we see artists like Picasso taking a great interest in tribal masks and the kinds of objects that are coming out of colonies in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So the very countries that have been colonized by European countries. Another important point I want to make is that think that scientific advancement, namely Einstein's second theory of relativity, throws such a wrench in our basic understanding of time and space that suddenly we start to get to the point where we realize maybe reality isn't exactly what we think it is. And there's such a great question asked in the Robert Hughes series around the ideas of, Cezanne is the first artist to really say, it's not so much what I'm looking at, it's a question of, is it possible to know what I'm seeing? Do I really understand reality in the way that I think I do? So keep that in mind, that the very notion of reality really comes into question at this particular point in history. And the Cubists will examine that problem very, very directly in their work with regard to the idea that when we look at something, it might be more important to see it from many points of view than from one static point of view. That'll make more sense when you look at the videos. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to go to the compare and contrast. And what I've done is I've given you a link to this particular very short video on writing a compare and contrast essay. So please review it. And in order to help you sort of unpack the video a little bit, I've made some notes. But what exactly are we comparing and contrasting? So what we're looking at are these two images, right? This is a Cézanne painting versus the Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is a Picasso painting that is introduced this week. Now, so when we do a compare and contrast essay, we're basically taking one artwork and we're looking at it and trying to find similarities as well as differences to another artwork. What might that look like? So when we write about this, what I've done is I've taken this little video and I've broken it down this way. So basically what the video says is that when you write a comparison and contrast essay, there are two ways to do this. One is called a block method, and the other is a point-by-point method. We're actually going to focus on the point-by-point method, but I want to take you very briefly through the other one. And in doing so, I hope that shows why the point-by-point method is a better way of going about it. So the most basic way to think about a compare and contrast essay is to develop an introduction and a thesis like you would any piece of writing, any piece of academic writing. And then from there, you talk about everything that's similar about both artworks in one paragraph. And then logically, you would then start another paragraph and talk about everything that's different about both artworks, each of the two artworks, in that second paragraph, and then share your findings in a conclusion. That's the most basic way to do it. The video also talks about this idea of a subject-to-subject block essay, which is where you would introduce what you're going to be speaking about, and then from there, talk about all the features of one object. So you might talk about the color. You might talk about the subject matter that's used. You might talk about whether form is depicted in a very realistic way, or does the artist rely on distortions or stylizations. Then what you would do is do the same thing, same exact thing performed on the second artwork. The problem with this method is all the contrasts and comparisons have to be made in the mind of the reader when they look at one paragraph versus the next. In other words, you're not spelling out those similarities and differences. That's why I don't think this one is necessarily the best way to go. But I do think it's important to show you that that is one way that a comparison and contrast essay is structured. Now, let's look at this way. This is called the point-by-point method, and I do think it's the better way to go. The point-by-point method, right, also starts out with an introduction and a thesis, and then starts out by talking about one point to discuss. In other words, let's start with color. So what you would do is you would talk about the way one artist uses color in their particular artwork and the way the other artist uses color in the other artwork. So you see, the paragraph is structured by the point being made. Then from there you'd move on and you'd talk about the subject matter. In what ways are the subject matter alike between the two paintings, and in what ways is the subject matter different? And then finally you might talk about, say, how realistic are each of these pieces? You would talk about one and discuss whether the artist is true to depicting, imitating nature and showing the objects in that particular work with a certain amount of, say, exactitude in terms of what they're looking at, or are they trying to distort and stylize? These kinds of things can make a really big difference, right, in terms of how we understand a painting, particularly a painting, which is what we're looking at right now. And then from there, you would write a conclusion that tells us a little bit something more about what you found and what you think that what might be the significance of the similarities and differences between this artwork. So when you write your first discussion post this week, this is what you want to do, and then you're responding to other people's posts. So I hope this is clear. I'm also going to take this information and send it to you as an announcement so that you can see it spelled out right there and you can refer back to it. You can also listen to this video again if you prefer to learn by hearing and looking at text at the same time. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful. And as always, please don't hesitate to email with questions for me. And let's see how we do this week discussing our topics, which is basically primitivism, the interest in non-Western art and how that interest creeps into Western painting. Fauvism, which is a use of color in very expressive ways that don't necessarily represent the objects themselves. So a unique use of non-local color. And then Cubism, which is primarily about looking at objects from different points of view at the same time. Looking at a thing as you might see it from different parts of, say, walking around a room and looking at something from different perspectives, but then putting all of those perspectives together. All right, everybody, enjoy week 4, and as I said, get in touch if you think you have some questions.